Senator Edward Kennedy says he felt surrounding the events on Chappaquiddick Island in 1969.
Kennedy drove a car off a narrow bridge and into a pond on Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts.
I was accompanied by Miss Mary Jo Kopechne.
Ted didn't report the incident for 10 hours, by which time a bunch of questions were raised.
Welcome to Unshut Cases. On today's episode, we have with us an incredible attorney, returning guest out of Cincinnati, Ohio, Shane the Shark Herzner of Herzner Law. Shane, thank you so much for joining us today on Unshut Cases.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you back here. I'm Dan Taft, the host of the show again. We are discussing a really, really interesting case here in your criminal defense firm, DUI lawyer out of Ohio. We're going to go all the way back here to 1969 to the Chappaquiddick incident, the Ted Kennedy case, which there is just so much still uncertainty and kind of questions about exactly what happened there. And I'll kind of dive right into it, and we can kind of go back and forth here so I can get your expert, insight into what, you think and kind of your take on this one. And obviously in the current political climate we're in now, this is just an interesting case to revisit for a number of reasons. One being, holding people in public office and higher office accountable, what that looks like, how they're treated versus how the average citizen is treated, all those kinds of things that feel so prevalent today in 2024 going into this upcoming presidential election. Different versions of this were happening 55 years ago and longer. So it is just kind of an interesting one to talk about. For anyone unfamiliar with Chappaquiddick, Ted Kennedy was a United States Senator, obviously, of the Kennedy family in Massachusetts. He was the youngest ever Senate Majority Whip, and he was a clear contender and arguably a frontrunner for the 1972 presidential election. This is on the heels of the JFK assassination, on the Robert Kennedy assassination. Mary Jo Kopechne was a 28-year-old campaign worker for U.S. Senator Bobby Kennedy, his 1968 presidential campaign, until his assassination in June of 1968. So the night of this incident, Kennedy was at Chappaquiddick Island hosting a reunion party for the Boiler Room Girls, a group of young women who had worked on his brother Robert's presidential campaign, including Mary Jo. The 6 Boiler Room Girls is what they were, named by and called at the time. They were all in their 20s and single. The men at this party were not permitted to bring their wives. This comes into play in the case. This was all mere days before the moon landing, which may have contributed to less media coverage than would normally be expected in a high-profile incident like this. So that night, midnight, July 18th, 1969, the Senator Ted Kennedy drove his car off a narrow bridge, causing it to overturn into the water. Mary Jo Kopechne was trapped inside the vehicle. She died. They had left a party off the eastern end of Martha's Vineyard, allegedly on the way to the ferry to take her back home. Ted accidentally made a wrong turn onto a dirt road, leading to a one-lane bridge. At least that is his story. Kopechne told no one else that she was leaving for the night with Kennedy. In fact, she left her purse and hotel key at the party. After his car skidded off the bridge into the pond, Kennedy swam free, departed from the crash site. Mary Jo did not survive. Kennedy walked on foot back to the party. His route took him past 4 houses. He did not attempt to contact any local residents. He returns to the cottage, where the party is still in progress. He quietly summons his friends and lawyers, Joseph Gargan, who was also his cousin, kind of adopted brother of the Kennedy family, and Paul F. Markham, who was the U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. Gargan then drives the 3 to the site of the crash to try to rescue Kopechne. Gargan and Markham jumped into the pond, tried to repeatedly rescue her, but were not able to due to the strong tidal current. Gargan then drove them to the ferry landing, where the 3 discussed what they should do. While standing next to a public phone booth at the landing, Gargan and Markham insisted multiple times that the crash had to be reported to the authorities. This would not happen until 6 hours later, when the police were already involved. So Ted Kennedy does not report this. Fails to report the incident to the police until 10 a.m. the next morning. In the meantime, a diver retrieves Kopechne's body from Kennedy's car. Examiner rules she dies of suffocation and publicly asserted that she likely would have survived if a more timely rescue attempt had been conducted. So there's the aftermath here, which is the litigation. Kennedy pleads guilty to a charge of leaving the scene of an accident, receives a 2-month suspended jail sentence, says that his conduct immediately after the crash had made no sense to him at all, and that he regarded his failure to report the crash immediately as indefensible.
My conduct and conversations during the next several hours, to the extent that I can remember them, make no sense to me at all.
A judicial inquest concluded that Kennedy and Chappaquiddick had not intended to take the ferry and that Kennedy had intentionally turned toward the bridge, operating his vehicle negligently, if not recklessly, and at too high a speed for the hazard which the bridge posed in the dark. The judge stopped short of recommending charges, and a grand jury convened, returning no indictments. Later, a registry of motor vehicles hearing resulted in Kennedy's driver's license being suspended for 16 months. The outcome, as the only one of the four Kennedy brothers left alive, many thought Ted Kennedy would likely become president. After the incident, he makes a decision not to run for president in 1972 and 76. He does eventually run in 1980, but earns only 37.6% of the vote, losing the nomination to incumbent U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Many cite the incident and consequent negative public opinion as the reason for his loss. And that said, the citizens of Massachusetts largely stood by him. He went on to become ranked fifth in U.S. history for length of continuous service as senator. So that is the full story basically there, right? And then we have a million different questions because this is very, very fuzzy. It is before any kind of cell phones, smartphones. I mean, we're living, 1969 is an era where something like this can happen and you're just left with whatever someone tells you about it, right? Shane, can you kind of tell us sort of your perception of this case as a whole and kind of, I have a bunch of questions here for you, but what is sort of your, as a DUI lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer, what is your take on this whole thing, how you kind of see it?
Yeah, Dan, I mean, it's an absolutely unbelievable story when you look back at it now. And I was just talking that I thought I knew a lot about this incident. And then I started doing some research in preparation for this. And it's like, wow, I didn't know as much as I thought I did. So there's so much that's out there that maybe was kept quiet until a few years later. It's definitely a story looking at it from a defense perspective. I think Ted Kennedy was very fortunate to have the results and the only that one charge to come about as a result of this accident. So it's really amazing, and he was very fortunate to have that happen.
Yeah. In your perception or your opinion, if this had been an unknown person, not Ted Kennedy, just regular civilian, what do you think the charges would have been in this kind of incident? Yeah,
if it wasn't reported, obviously you have the leaving of the scene, and that's a misdemeanor if it involves bodily harm. So the penalties for that, my understanding, are somewhere between 2 weeks of jail time up to 2 years. So at minimum, by not reporting it, that would be the case. And then you're looking at a misdemeanor manslaughter case, too, manslaughter by motor vehicle. That carries 30 days in jail up to 2.5 years. And then potentially a felony charge here. If the state was able to prove that he was driving under the influence, so DUI, they also have to prove that he was either reckless or negligent. And then they could get a felony manslaughter. And then at that point, you're looking at 2.5 years up to 15 years in prison. So those are the three charges really that he's looking at, or a normal person would be looking at if they were arrested on this particular night.
Yeah. And he said at the time that he had not been drinking or was not drunk. I don't think they ever, tested his blood alcohol content or anything like that. But considering the context of what was going on that night and the accident itself, it seems a little unlikely that he would not have been drinking at all, which obviously is a whole other part of this, right? Because if he's drunk or even under the influence and this happens, then you have a whole other, kind of angle in terms of criminal prosecution.
Absolutely. It takes it from a misdemeanor to a felony. And like you said, it's hard to believe that he wasn't drinking on this particular night when they were celebrating kind of a welcome party. And I do know that they did take Mary Jo's BAC, and her BAC was over a 0.09, I believe is what it was. And that, of course, was some hours later.
Right. What is the difference between leaving the scene, which he does here, and staying at the site of the crash in terms of charges? Hypothetically speaking, like if he had not fled or stayed on the scene, what is the difference there just from a legal standpoint?
Right. At that point, then he would only potentially have been looking at the misdemeanor manslaughter charge. If she did not survive, like in this particular case. So by leaving the scene and not reporting it like he was supposed to, and when you have bodily injury like this, it's supposed to be reported immediately, not 12 hours later or 10 hours later, whatever it was that he reported it. So that's supposed to be reported immediately. And if he were to have reported it immediately, they obviously would have done an investigation, try to determine whether he was negligent, reckless in this particular night. He may not have been charged with anything potentially, but the leaving the scene with bodily injury is what they ultimately decided to charge him. And in my opinion, at the very least, they should have charged him with.
And you said before you thought like 2 years of prison time or something may come from something like this. He served no prison time. I think it was time served or something like that. From what I researched, it was like the judge said he had already been punished enough, or he'd be punished enough. I'm assuming they mean emotionally or psychologically from this. But again, it kind of draws that line, right? But between the average citizen, like if someone else had happened to versus someone that feels like they're so protected, they could be faced a relatively severe prison sentence from this, right?
Yeah, he was given I think a 2-year suspended sentence. So basically, just don't get in any more trouble and everything goes away, which is crazy. And one of the things the judge cited, like you said, was I think his driving record, that he didn't have any prior driving record or something like that. And then when they looked at it, it came out, well, he had been in trouble a couple different times for, I think, reckless driving at one point and then driving without a license. And it's still unclear. And I'm not sure if he even had a license on this particular night to be driving anyway. So some of the reasons the judge cited were misguided and definitely were not supported by the facts.
In terms of additional charges, could there have been additional charges for how many opportunities Ted had to alert the authorities? Meaning the fact that he waited so long, what does that look like from a legal standpoint of just not reporting for that long?
I don't know if that would necessarily bring about additional charges than the leaving the scene with bodily injury. But what I do think it goes to show is his culpability and maybe the fact that he was potentially trying to cover things up or hoping that maybe things would go away. I'm not exactly sure, obviously, what his mindset. I don't think he knows what his mindset was at that time. But as far as additional charges as a result of that, probably not. Now, leaving the scene would make it difficult for authorities to try to show that he was under the influence, though. So that is a charge that he could have potentially avoided by not being on scene, since they didn't actually talk to him until, I think, 11 or 12 o'clock the next day.
We were just touching on before was the license. And from what I had looked at or researched about this, I believe I think his license was expired when this happened. So meaning, again, it's just another thing, right? Like, granted, they did not run a blood alcohol content test on him, but he very well could have been drunk or at least under the influence, no license. It's like all of these things together, if you were actually charged with all those and then leaving the scene and not reporting it, it starts to become, it's not just one thing, right? It's 4 or 5 or 6 potentially. Whatever those number of charges are, they compound, right? In terms of from a legal standpoint.
Yes, well, I think the charges could potentially compound, as well as, like I said, taking responsibility for it. So when you're leaving, when you walk by houses and lights are on and you don't go into that house, you go back to where you came from, you don't mention anything to the people at the party other than your cousin and an attorney, and both of them are actually attorneys, and then you reconvene back at the spot, talk about it, think that you have kind of a plan, and he apparently, without acquiescing or saying that he was going to call, it was their understanding, he jumps into the water and swims back to his hotel. So there's a lot of his actions that I think would have normally, with a normal person, if they were charged with the leaving the scene with bodily harm, would have meant that they would have gotten a greater penalty. I mean, that's just total lack of any kind of thought for a person's life by his actions alone.
How much weight does the initial medical examiner who arrives at the scene have in terms of testifying? That person, how crucial are they in these kinds of cases?
Yeah, and in this particular case, it was a little strange because I think originally she was said to have drowned. And so they were I think the indication was that the car filled up pretty quickly and she drowned within minutes. And then you get somebody else, the medical examiner who actually recovered her body, says, wait a second, there was an air pocket in this car. And there was an air pocket even when they recovered her, but she died of suffocation. Essentially, there wasn't any oxygen. Even though there was an air pocket, there was no oxygen in there. So the testimony of a medical examiner, especially at a grand jury hearing or something, could have played a huge part, because it does, I think, make a difference whether she died right away versus 4 hours later. Because again, if he would have reported this or got authorities there right away, they could have potentially saved her life. They think that she could have potentially been in the car for at least 4 hours alive, waiting for help to come.
That is horrifying.
Yes.
Like, absolutely terrifying. And you can only imagine if that was what happened. It's just crazy to think about that, right? And that, again, to me feels more, I don't know if you could say someone is more culpable. He's already seems so culpable, but it's like, it just makes it worse and worse, right? The more you kind of start putting all these details together, it's like, you just had to make a phone call, just do the right thing quickly. And there was only one course of action there, which was try to get someone there immediately.
It's almost like a little kid who gets in trouble, and then they try to cover it up, and they figure out my parents won't find out about it or something. And it just makes the situation so much worse. And it is, it's incredibly sad, because there were ample opportunities when he walked to the party, when they came back to the phone booth. Nobody called anybody at that point. He swam to his hotel. He swam across the pond to the street to walk to his hotel. He was there at I think they were estimating around 2:30 in the morning. Yep. Nothing. He didn't report anything at all, even when he was back in the hotel.
Yeah, it's just wild. What role do you think the media played in the handling of this case? Again, we're in 1969, so the media landscape is a different universe from where we are today. No internet, no 24-hour news coverage. You're back in your sort of basic cable stations world of 1969. It feels like that the control over that is so much more tight, right? Like you have all these filters and a sort of ability to kind of control narrative in a way that now feels like you wouldn't necessarily have that control. It would just spin out of control. But in terms of the media in this specific case, what is your perception of sort of how they handled this and kind of painted him, almost as a victim? I mean, it feels like he was kind of painted that way.
And I think that's the way that they were trying to portray it, quite frankly. I know when he did give a statement to the police department, he spoke with the chief, the head person there. That report, he never signed it. It was never released in its entirety. There was a lot of cover up. So I think the media didn't have all the full information. They only had what was given to them. And that was from the Kennedy family and the people that were there, that were obviously wanting to do what was in his best interest. So keeping it kind of quiet. And then, of course, of all places where he was, the media loves him there to begin with anyway. So I think he probably was viewed very favorably in the media. And then, of course, you have the moon landing a few days after that.
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar surface.
So that kind of got buried under that, because that was a much bigger story at that point. So the media, when it comes to portraying it, they did absolutely, they were limited on information that I think that they had. And any information that they did have, they definitely made it look like Mr. Kennedy, Ted Kennedy here was almost a victim in this particular case. It wouldn't fly today. There's absolutely no way that would fly today.
What do you think the long-term ramifications were from this for Ted Kennedy? Again, he was sort of poised to at least run for the presidential, office in the upcoming election. Obviously, that didn't happen. He did end up serving one of the longest, careers as a U.S. senator. But in terms of how this sort of played out, the perception of him, what were some of those ramifications for Ted Kennedy?
Yeah, I think you could see that as time went on and people started gathering more information, although he didn't get additional charges. Like you said, the grand jury decided not to indict. I think the grand jury, they had testimony, about 20 minutes worth of testimony, and that was it. And none of the people who testified at the grand jury were originally part of the investigation. So it was a total sham grand jury. I mean, let's face it, that's what it was. So as information started coming out, I think people started to realize the facts and that there was more culpability here, that there were opportunities for him to report it and that he just failed to. And so once the national media started getting involved in it, then it was really difficult for him politically to try to do anything outside of his home state because of his lack of thoughtfulness on this particular night. It would have been incredibly difficult for him to do anything more than his Senate seat where he was. So it pretty much limited him on his ability to, I guess, further his political career. I know he thought that time would pass and that potentially he may be able to run, and he did run for president later on, but you could see that this incident at that point, even though it had been some time, it pretty much ruined his political career.
How do you think an incident like this would play out differently if it happened today? Obviously, there's probably a million different kinds of answers to that question, but just in terms of 55 years ago versus right now, the same exact thing happens. What does that look like now?
There's no way it would have been the same way. I mean, there would have been a lot more investigation done. I could tell you the scrutiny would have been a lot worse. And I think that there would have definitely been additional charges. Now, whether they would have filed the felony charge or not of manslaughter, I don't know, because again, there's that lack of them being able to prove the DUI at that point. But I don't see any way at all that he could have gotten out of the manslaughter. Now, we got to also look at it in the same scope that the family of Mary Jo's family didn't want anything really to happen in this particular case. I think they were sad and they didn't think that Mr. Kennedy was necessarily responsible for this. So that plays a big role into things too. So if the family doesn't want to proceed with charges or didn't want anything major to happen to Ted Kennedy as a result, then his sentence or the ultimate outcome may not have served prison or jail time, is what I'm trying to say. But I can tell you, as far as the attention and the details getting out, those would have come out much quicker. The scrutiny would have been much harsher. And quite frankly, I think he would have had to have resigned his Senate seat. And I think his entire political career would have been over with at that point. Because of the details now that you're looking at, that just, it wouldn't fly with today's society. And it would have been out so quick too. It would have been out so quick. You're looking at a married man whose wife is pregnant, driving around with a 28-year-old woman, taking her home and at least allegedly taking her home. And there's some questions about, I think there's an hour gap of time where there was a police officer that may have noticed their car earlier. So there's some questions about what he was doing during this hour time frame with her as well. So there's a lot that plays into this where I don't think he would have survived the media scrutiny, at least politically survived the media scrutiny. He may have gotten out of the felony manslaughter charge, but I think that there definitely should have been at least a misdemeanor manslaughter charge here.
Yeah, and I was going to bring those things up as well, because that is a whole other angle to this case, right? His wife was pregnant. The relationship between him and Mary Jo was certainly questioned, whether it was reciprocal or not, what his intentions may have been in the car, and where that, to your point, the police officer did spot them. When I was reading about this and researching, there's, kind of like the lover's lane type of thing of, again, 1969, right? So him having her sort of alone in this isolated place without the wives there, the whole thing, it's like just one detail after the next. And does he drive off when the cop spots him to kind of, and is that why he goes down the wrong way and goes across this bridge? It's like all those, to your point about the investigation, it almost feels like none of these questions were raised here. And there's a lot to kind of dig into, right? So his cousin, Joe Gargan, and his friend, neither of them were charged with anything, both the attorneys, right? Yes. Despite failing to report the incident as well. Why was that? How were they sort of not implicated? And no aiding and abetting, no sort of, accomplice type thing where it was like they somehow seemed completely removed from any charges?
I think first and foremost, probably part of a cover up as well. Or hey, we're doing this for Ted. We're going to do this for you guys. It's my understanding from my research of this particular case is that both of them, all three of them, were right there by the water. They were at a phone booth, near a phone booth. The two attorneys recommended, hey, Ted, you have to call the police. You have to call the police. he kind of gave some mumbled response and then jumped right back in the water. So they thought, hey, he's going to take care of us. Now he kind of threw the mud back on them, saying, well, hey, they knew about it. I thought maybe they were. It was so crazy back and forth. It's to think that he reported it at 10 o'clock. And when he reported it at 10 o'clock, they had already found the car. They found the car, I think, right around 9 p.m. And the car, they'd misidentified the person in the car. They didn't know that it was Mary Jo. There was another driver's license in the car. And so they were still trying to figure out the identity of the person. It wasn't until Ted Kennedy reported it at 10 o'clock at the police station that they knew who it was that was in the car. So there's so many different things in here, but I'm guessing it's probably because there were finger pointing between everybody, and they were trying to get this thing as far down the road as possible. They couldn't charge those two without charging Ted with additional charges too, would be my thought. So they were trying to just get it under the carpet as quickly as they possibly could. And again, there's some defenses that they thought that Ted Kennedy was going to call once he got back to his hotel room, because that's the indication. They absolutely, I think, it felt some remorse because they kept telling him, look, you've got to do the right thing. You have to do this. And I think as a result of all this, there was a kind of a falling out in the family as well.
Yeah, Joseph Gargan, I think, became estranged from the Kennedys after this. Why do you think citizens of Massachusetts largely stood by Ted after the fact? Is this just sort of the Kennedy aura and aristocracy and sort of royalty status they almost have in Massachusetts? Or was it just a sign of the time that you just believed anything a man in power said in 1969, and it was like he wasn't ever second guessed? It is strange how he's kind of maintained so much support after this.
It has to be just the Kennedy name, because once the facts came out, you knew, I mean, you saw that he wasn't going to be successful at running for president. Yet, you know, his home state kept reelecting him as a senator, which to me just, it doesn't make a lot of sense, knowing that somebody was responsible for somebody else's death. And yet, oh, well, you know, it was an accident. So I think it was kind of a combination of both the aura of the Kennedy name and the fact that they just believed anything that Ted Kennedy said at that point. They wanted to make sure that they viewed him more or less as part of the, maybe potentially one of the victims in this case.
Yeah. Now, I do want to just mention this, even though this feels like a complete harebrained conspiracy theory, but because I was researching this, I came across a lot of different things. Yeah. One thing that popped up, I don't believe this, but I just want to mention it because it does tie into something else that I kind of had familiarity with recently. Apparently, John Dean, there is a Richard Nixon, Richard Nixon, the White House tapes kind of came out where he was recorded. And there is something mentioned about this on one of those tapes where John Dean was recorded saying if Ted Kennedy knew the bear trap he was walking into at Chappaquiddick. There are some people that, there was these White House plumbers, Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, who kind of did a bunch of, the Watergate stuff and all the Nixon crime stuff. There were people that claimed that they were on the island that night, and that there's a whole conspiracy around this that I stumbled into when I was kind of researching about this, which, conspiracies can obviously be fun to kind of just play with in your mind. But at the same time, there's the whole Occam's razor, right? Which is just conspiracies are conspiracies. There's people that say this was a frame job. The chances of that seem next to zero to me. And I would say that, it is pretty clear here that Ted Kennedy was culpable, that he did slide from all of this. But, to the point of all the people in Massachusetts supporting him, there is sort of this, swell or movement of people who will kind of support them no matter what and try to kind of, make excuses for this kind of thing.
Yeah, it's crazy because if you look even at the original charge when the judge was doing everything at that hearing and sentenced him to the 2 years, he said, look, he stopped short of saying that he should have been charged, but he said he was probably reckless and negligent on that night.
Yeah.
So I think even the judge, I mean, the facts were so overwhelming. You have a lady leaving without her purse and her keys, so the story of him taking her to her hotel room doesn't quite correlate with the facts. There's just so many things that he stated that do not match up, that I think even the judge who sentenced him knew that and tried to kind of, I don't want to try to make his culpability look as minimal as possible.
Yeah. Well, Shane, thank you so much for walking through this case with us. It was great to get your expert insight. These are, DUI cases and the ramifications of those, wrongful death, manslaughter, all those things are things that you work with on a day-to-day basis at your firm. So thanks for being on Unshut Cases today. We hope to have you back soon.
Thanks so much. It was really enjoyable. This is a great story. Like I said, very interesting story.
Yeah, Shane, let our audience know, where can they find you if they need your services in Cincinnati or greater Ohio area?
Sure. The easiest way is my website, which is herznerlaw.com. You can also find me on Instagram and also on Facebook. My Instagram is Attorney Shane the Shark. And of course, my Facebook is just Herzner Law. You can find me there.
Awesome. Well, have you back on soon, Shane. And thank you again so much.
Thanks so much. You take care.